A large model Showman'S engine, part 77, a slight change of plan. Machining a longer copper tube to fit to the check valve so that water is admitted even lower down inside the boiler, and then the difficult part, refitting the external piping. In my hand are two pieces of copper pipe. The shorter pipe of the two is the one that I fitted to the check valve in the last episode. The other pipe, once machined, fitted and bent, should go much further down into the boiler. Originally I started to make this episode for my series Model Engineering for Beginners, but instead I decided to put it in this series because after all this part has been made for my large model Showman'S engine. Here's a piece of copper tube in the chuck of my Boxford lathe after facing and using a file to taper the end. Here I'm applying some cutting lubricant, and now using a tailstock die holder I'm starting to cut the thread. I started the operation by hand, but then I engaged back gear on the lathe to make it run slowly, then I machined the copper tube under power. All I had to do to complete the job was put the lathe in reverse and wind off the die. Machining and threading copper is quite difficult and you do need plenty of lubricant. I'm just using a commercial aerosol can full of metal cutting lubricant, and it's very clear in this image that I got a good thread. Although I did get a bit carried away with the threading, the thread is far too long. The obvious thing to do is to shorten the copper tubing at the threaded end using a cutting tool, but you have to be very careful because the copper is quite weak now it has a thread on it. In a situation like this, taking many light cuts is much better than taking less heavy cuts. Now the pipe is threaded, I'm going to enlarge the hole in the centre of it. Before starting, I apply some more cutting lubricant so that the drill goes into the hole very smoothly. A health and safety warning, beware of the swarf coming out of the hole. Although it looks very nice, it's very sharp, so don't handle it. It could catch up in the chuck. I've seen this happen many times, and it flails around, and if you get your hands in the way, or your face or any other part of your body, you're going to damage it. As this is a long piece of pipe, I needed to drill it from both ends, and here I've turned the part round and I'm drilling from the other end. As I've just mentioned, originally I made this episode for Model Engineering for Beginners, and here I'm showing the reduction in diameter of the piece of copper tubing. The rings on the copper tubing are caused by the chuck jaws marking the copper as it spun round in the jaws during the threading operation. One problem with using this lubricant is if it gets onto the chuck jaws, which it does, then the component that's been held in the chuck is much more likely to spin. Up to now I've been reducing the diameter of this piece of copper tubing by cutting from right to left. The threaded end of the piece of copper tubing is being held in a union nut which in turn is clamped tightly in the chuck. But because of the metal cutting lubricant which is now on the chuck jaws, I could not get the union nut to stay in a fixed position. It was constantly moving to the left. And if I clamp the union nut any tighter than this, it's going to damage the soft threads on the copper underneath. The copper tube is supported by a live centre, as you can see at the right hand side, so the logical thing to do is to cut from left to right. To avoid confusion, and I think I mentioned this in the last episode, this is a cutting tool that's designed to cut from left to right, and I use it frequently because it's better for the video process. I can rotate the tool post and move it out of the way. Once I'd finished turning the tube, I turned it round in the chuck and then used a barcode spanner to remove the union nut. I mention these spanners frequently by name, not because I have a sponsorship deal. These are the tools that I've used for many years and they really are very good. Now it's time to screw the completed part into the check valve. I'm using some Loctite 542 for this, which is a thread sealant. All was going well until I tried to bend the tube. Then this happened. It broke in half. I'd taken too much metal away. I did have a sneaking suspicion that this was going to happen because during the turning process, as it was definitely a tutorial, I did remove quite a lot more than I should have done. A simple answer to this problem: machine another piece of copper tube, but don't remove quite so much metal. I'm going to screw this piece of copper tubing into the check valve. Loctite 542 first, Then I firmly screwed the piece of tube into the check valve, and as I showed in the previous episode, I didn't use a pair of pliers. I clamped the piece of copper tubing into the chuck of one of my lathes and rotated the check valve to tighten it onto the tube. I need to bend the tube now, and I did this by brute force. Being a keyboard player, the muscles in my arms and hands are quite well developed, but it still took a lot of effort to bend the tube like this. When I replace the check valve in its position on the boiler, the copper pipe will deliver the water to the same area of the boiler as it would do if it was mounted on the midway point, and deliver the water into the water space, not the steam space. I bought one of the excellent injectors from John Holroyd at the Steam Workshop, but I want to prove a point. This injector is a Jubilee Fittings number 8 pints per minute, quite a high capacity, which is a bit on the high side for this size of boiler. I can fit the one that I bought from John no problem at all. That's a number 6, and its capacity is less, and I don't think I'd have to be doing what I'm doing to make this one work. Time will tell if my idea is successful. Down into the garage where the traction engine lives, and I'm fitting both of the gaskets and inserting the copper tube that needs a little bit of bending in situ. I'd better mention before viewers do that this copper pipe is not interfering with any of the fire tubes in the boiler. With a bit of pulling and pushing, and the added bonus of having slightly larger holes in the flange on the check valve, it goes into position OK. All I need to do now is tighten it up. And the reason it's pulled away from the boiler bush is because the nuts foul the body of the check valve if I don't fit it to the boiler bush in stages. Very slowly, using a small spanner and tightening each nut at each side a bit at a time, eventually the check valve moves into position and is very firmly fitted onto the boiler bush. I hope it's not going to leak. I don't think it will do with 2 gaskets and O-rings, but you never know. And now it's fun time. This job has been really difficult. You just would not believe how difficult it was to try and get this nut to engage with the check valve single-handedly. I really needed someone to support the other end. When I thought about it constructively, I realised I should fit the pipe at the injector end, then it would be supported, which is what I did. I used some black insulation tape to stop the nut from sliding down the pipe, and when I finished the job I removed the insulation tape. This is a small brass bracket that's just a guide for the pipe to the check valve, and it was a bit nerve-wracking fitting these small brass screws because if they fell on the floor I couldn't find them with a magnet. I managed to fit this bracket without dropping them, so everything was alright. The original injector is back in position, and I really am hoping this is going to be a successful operation and it will work. If it doesn't, I'll fit the one I bought from John Holroyd. But to fit John Holroyd's injector, I will have to make a slight modification to the plumbing. And that's it. It's time to fit the ashpan and give the engine a steam test. I think I will wait until the weather gets better though. It's no fun steam testing in the rain. I'm just pleased that everything's back in place. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my main Steam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.